Hello, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and a very special guest on the show. Not only is he a Purple Insider newsletter subscriber, a listener to the podcast, owns a Purple Insider shirt, but also is a great reporter for the Frederick News and Post in Maryland. And talk about small world here. That just happens to be where Jordan Addison, the Vikings first round pick, is from. Josh Smith. It's great to get together with you, Josh. We have talked many times about the Vikings, but I didn't think, other than Chuck Foreman being from your area, that we would ever have a reason to get together on the pod until the Vikings drafted Jordan Addison. So, what is up, man? How are you?
I'm great, man. This is so cool. It's like I'm like having an outer body experience or something. And in line with like the draft, the in honor of the draft and those incredibly terrible like post draft pick interviews, like I want to shout out to the heavenly football father here. Without him, this wouldn't be possible. I wouldn't be on this podcast with you on a podcast I listen to like literally every night on my drive home from work. So thank the good Lord upstairs for the Vikings drafting Jordan Addison and having this possible for me.
I mean, I remember weeks ago, I put Jordan Addison on the Vikings in a draft sim, and you sent me a message. You're like, he's from here. Hopefully they do it. And I don't think either one of us thought they would. I don't know how many I've ever got right. I did get Brian O'Neill right once upon a time in a draft sim, but for the most part, every year, I'm just taking guesses like everybody else. But then, this ends up working out. And of course, as you know, as a longtime listener slash subscriber, the drum was being banged for many years for a wide receiver for the Vikings, just because, I mean, everybody knows the argument, the value of having a number two or even a number three wide receiver. You shouldn't, as you have, Chris Carter memorabilia in the background, shouldn't have to explain that to any Vikings fans. But I would love you to offer some insight, having written about him, coming from that area, about what the Vikings are getting in Jordan Addison and just his background.
Yeah, they're getting. I mean, you hear all the words that people are throwing out there about him. Polished, technical, savvy is a good word I like with him. You hear people talk about like his short area quickness, because if you look at his speed and his like 40-yard dash times, he's not a burner. He's not gonna, you know, tear off straight down the field a la Randy Moss and score long touchdowns like that. That's not his thing. And I think what he does bring is going to be a really nice replacement. It's going to be really hard to replace Thielen, obviously, but like he can do a lot of the things that Thielen did, aside from maybe some of that like red zone expertise that Thielen had and sort of had developed over the years. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a challenge for him physically, maybe. And you hear people talk about his size and speed ratio. I guess you want him, if he's going to be a little smaller, you want him to be, like a 4.4 or a 4.3 guy or something. But I'm really, it's crazy, man. Like I watched a lot of his college stuff. I followed very closely what he did in college, obviously, and what it doesn't matter. That stuff sort of doesn't matter because of what he does well. Like he is the very epitome of like a student of the game, and a lot of what he does well, the word preternatural, I think is the word I would use with this. For like he's like it just comes to him. The way he plays is almost natural. And so I was thinking about him a little bit as we were I was getting ready to do this, and I started to remember what you and your fellow reporters would say about like Dalvin Cook when he first got into training camp with the Vikings, and he was just doing stuff that like picking up blitzes, and his football IQ was just through the roof. And that is what Addison has. I think, regardless of what his knocks might be, what he does well is going to be what carries him. And I don't think there's going to be a situation where there's going to be a big learning curve with him. Another thing about him is that he learned how to play wide receiver once he got to college, essentially. So you asked me about his background a little bit, and I wrote about him extensively, I guess, right after his breakout season at Pitt. When he was in high school, he was essentially an option quarterback, and he had come up through the youth ranks as an option quarterback, and he played on a high school team in our county that was just not very good. Like they just didn't have talent around him, and they certainly didn't have someone who could deliver the ball to him if they put him at receiver. So essentially, what the coaches all throughout his youth time and even into high school, what they thought was, let's get the ball in this guy's hands. He's the best playmaker we have, and let's go from there. And so, in addition to him playing defense, he was playing defensive back too. So he got this vantage point of the game from an early age. And then finally, I think during his senior year, he started to play a little more wide receiver. But quite honestly, it wasn't until he got to Pitt that he could really focus on that craft. And again, like he just had this sort of, I think his footwork was something that was very helpful to him. He had, he was, another comparison I can make is like he gives off a lot of Diggs vibes. Like I hate to make comparisons, but like he gives off those vibes because Diggs is not a burner. He runs in the 4.5 range, 4.4, 4.5. But his like short area quickness, his route running, sort of his expertise in all of that is what carries his game. And I think that like with Addison, he started to get some coaching when he got to Pitt, and he had a really good wide receivers coach. His name was Chris Beatty, and Chris Beatty was at Maryland when DJ Moore was there, and then he moved to Pitt. And so that's who essentially got him to Pitt because a lot of the schools, I think about 20 D1 schools were recruiting him, and a lot of those schools wanted him as a defensive back, and essentially largely because of his footwork and stuff. That's a really difficult position, I think, for footwork when you're backpedaling, all of that sort of stuff. But this guy saw him at a camp, realized his potential as a wide receiver, and that's why he ended up going to Pitt. And it was almost like I remember maybe the first thing I read about Jordan at Pitt once he was there was their coach. I'm drawing a blank on their coach. He likened Jordan to Antonio Brown, and I was like, whoa! Like this kid literally just got into practice. It was like the spring of his freshman year. Literally just graduated from like Tuscarora High School, and is focusing for the first time in his life like fully on being a wide receiver, and he's being compared to Antonio Brown. So just a lot of his skills they come to him naturally, but he also has this mind for football, and when he's taught something, from what I understand, he can learn it and implement it immediately.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of that matches up with what Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell said about him, which was, I think Kwesi said something like, this guy was born to play football kind of thing. Like he has
Yes.
just this natural way about him and instincts. I think it's really interesting that he did not come from a high school that was a dominant program. And I think he was a 4-star recruit, which is still obviously pretty good, but maybe not somebody that was like coming from South Florida as a 5-star recruit and going to Bama. Like he kind of had to take a roundabout way around this. I also thought it was very interesting when we talked to him that he said that one of the reasons he wanted to play wide receiver, the way that it came together, was one, he was inspired by Stefon Diggs because Stefon Diggs is from Maryland as well and went to Maryland. And he also said that he had a conversation with his brother, and I understand he has a big family, so one of his brothers, and he said, like, you need the ball in your hands. You don't need to be a defensive back. You need to have the football in your hands, and it all kind of came together. But, I mean, talk about, again, like small world stuff, you and I being on the show. Also, the Vikings top pick wide receiver being inspired to turn to wide receiver by Stefon Diggs.
Yeah, and Diggs, I believe, for a time when he was young, played in the county where Jordan is from, and then eventually, I guess, moved to Montgomery County and started playing in the same youth league that Jordan did. So I'm assuming that Jordan saw him play throughout the years when he was a kid in that league, because Diggs is, I don't know how much older he is right now, but it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that Jordan saw him playing youth football while he was in that very same league. And it is very cool. And I think they are very similar athletes. And I hate to project that, but I really don't think, and I think with Diggs, like they gave him a little time, to get incorporated in the game, on the team until he got, I think he wasn't like getting starts until some injuries happened his rookie year with the Vikings. I'm not sure I see that happening with Addison. I think he's going to be incorporated like right away, and I don't think the playbook is going to prevent him from getting on the field early and often, because again, like he just has that ability to absorb stuff. And I wonder if I hope he's talked to Diggs. Like that guy he'd be a great person for him to talk to about the experience of coming into the league, and he could not be like a better sort of example as to how to go about playing that position in the league.
And I personally learned a lot just from Stefon Diggs in general. I mean, knowing him and talking to him, but also watching him about what makes a great wide receiver. Because we always talk so much about the size, the speed, what their relative athletic score is, everything else. You look up Diggs' relative athletic score, it's like 50th percentile. Like he's an average
Yeah.
athlete for the position, and yet he is one of the 5 best players in the league. Now, Justin Jefferson's 97th percentile, so it does help to be that fast and that big. But I think that is such a fascinating part about the position where it's like every edge rusher almost looks some version of the,
Right.
one or two things, right? They're either like shorter, quicker, or they're like super lanky. Every nose tackle is very fat. Every offensive tackle is 6'8". But yet wide receiver, they're all over the map. And that's why when I was doing the research leading up to this, and I was asking around about smaller wide receivers, and even, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah talked about it. And he's not tiny from a height perspective, but he certainly is from a weight perspective. He's very slender. And all the research I could find was basically like, look, if you're at least 5'11, then you could probably, or 5'10, 5'11, then you could probably make it. And I think it just really says a lot about how technical this is. And Diggs won with technique. So it's almost like, in a way, an IQ test if someone watches Stefon Diggs and wants to emulate that, because it's so clear like he is winning with being such a technical player and not just by running past people. Almost nobody can do that in the NFL.
I would say, yeah, exactly the same with Addison. Like, don't look at that relative athletic score for him, because I think, well, at the combine, like he had to bow out. He had like an ankle issue that like flared up or something, so he didn't do most of that stuff. So his relative athletic score from there was like 50th percentile, is like you said. But I would say, just throw that out. I mean, you just have to, and also don't worry about how big this kid is. I'm serious, because like he's not going to get any bigger. Like I've talked to his mother about it. Genetically, he's just who he is. I think he weighs like 173 pounds. That's what he weighed in at the combine. As he gets older and matures, maybe he puts on like a few more pounds, or maybe once he gets into an NFL like training program that's a little bit different, and they can figure out ways to add a little more bulk to him. But like, I don't think that's changing. And I wouldn't, there are certain things that, yeah, might give him problems because of his frame, like a guy jamming him at the line or whatever. But again, like his short area ability and just his ability to like get away from those guys, right off the snap, is what he's gonna succeed with that. And I don't know how often you think they'll have him playing outside. Like I heard you talking about how they needed an outside guy. If they're looking at receiver, I mean, I don't know. He can play outside, and he'll tell you he can play anywhere, and he can run any level routes. But I do sort of wonder what you think about how often they'll have him outside.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at his college usage, he did both. And I think that, well, I mean, how many actual snaps will someone line outside the numbers with press man coverage? I mean, in an NFL season, it's probably only like 20% of the snaps. Teams play a lot of zones, they play off coverage, and you're getting free releases, or you're even technically, if you're the outside wide receiver in a condensed split, you still have a two-way go, whether you can release inside or outside. I do think, based on the numbers and a great website, Reception Perception, that's run by Matt Harmon of Yahoo Sports, he did point out that when he was asked to run like a go route against press coverage, which is very specific, but he was not very successful in doing that, which means
Right.
you have to beat him off the line of scrimmage almost instantly and then get on top of the corner with your speed. That might not be his thing, but when he was running ins, digs,
Yep.
comebacks, stuff like that, which is a lot higher percentage of the routes, And a big thing is what you mentioned about just mastering what they ask you to do, because we saw last year that Kevin O'Connell was very good at scheming wide receivers open. And there were a lot of times where we were going, where was the defense on even Justin Jefferson at
Exactly.
times? So I think that he's going to get a lot of favorable matchups with Justin Jefferson taking up so much attention. I do wonder what you think about. He talked about this when he transferred from Pitt to USC. It's very funny about the timing of things because he took a lot of criticism for that. And he was one of the first guys that was sort of talked about as, oh, is he doing it for the NIL? Which now, I mean, who isn't doing it for the
Right.
NIL? But it's sort of a part of his story that he decided to make that move to USC. And it seems like it ultimately ended up turning out very good for him, despite housing prices in LA. Maybe he didn't factor that versus going to Pitt. But I just think it's an interesting kind of element there that the timing, he was maybe one of the only players to ever actually take heat for doing that.
He was a flashpoint. Like I remember when it started, the news started leaking out. It was leaking out of Pitt because they were mad that he was leaving. My stance on the whole thing, man, I was like, go do what you want to do, man. Go where you want to go. The rules are set up for these kids now to take advantage of that. And I don't know, man. If you ask me, where was the negative in him doing that? He was on a successful team that had a Heisman Trophy candidate quarterback, and that guy left for the NFL, and his offensive coordinator left, and his wide receivers coach left. So why would he stick around there? Like this was a perfect opportunity for him to say, you know what? You know what I'm going to show you, NFL scouts? I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm going to go all the way across the country, and I'm going to learn a new playbook, a complicated playbook, as I would imagine, coming from the coach that was out at USC. And I'm going to master that playbook in one off season, and I'm going to put up numbers, and I'm going to go to the NFL. So he did it, and I don't know what the like. Look, we heard all kinds of rumors. We could never get we never heard anything confirmed about an NIL deal from him. And I have a friend, a guy who covers USC for, I think it's Rivals, and he said even out there, like we never got confirmation that he got any big NIL deal. But you know what? If he did, good for him. Like I wrote, I wrote a column about that. Like, I mean, these kids need to go get what they can get when they can get it. And I don't know. I saw no negatives in his transfer whatsoever. I only saw like, I saw it adding more to his profile.
It's funny because it used to be a thing where coaches would talk about, well, if somebody's transferred, you got to look into that and you got to wonder what was wrong there and why couldn't he deal with whatever this or that. And now it's like, try find a player who didn't transfer from a
Yeah.
lot of these schools. Unless you went to Bama or Georgia, you might have a couple of different schools on your list, which I think is interesting. With Jordan Addison, I guess, as far as like remaining questions for him, I think it's entirely just about the fit that makes this work for me. But I guess you would wonder about, you mentioned the ankle injury and stuff like that. I guess running through anything that could kind of prevent him from stepping right in and being an excellent wide receiver. But I feel like this is one that just checks so many boxes for all the things that we know about wide receivers and his background.
I agree. And like you've mentioned numerous times on your podcast and in your writing, I mean, as a wide receiver too is an incredibly valuable thing to have these days. And if you can get him under contract for 5 years as a first rounder and pay him, the minimum of what you have to pay for a wide receiver too, who eventually I think is going to be like a legit wide receiver too, who's going to catch, who's going to get 60, 70 catches a season. And sorry, Adam Thielen, I love you, but he would just catch it and go down. There was no like yak yardage with him. So like you're going to get some of that with Addison. So, this season, I wouldn't be surprised if he caught, 50 balls and had more yardage than Thielen had last year, just because they're going to get him in space. He's got that quickness that he's going to be able to elude defenders and get some, run after the catch yardage. And man, you can't, like, when you have Jefferson consuming so much attention, you have to be able to, have other options. And, even O'Connell will be able to scheme things for Addison just because of his intellect on the field. So, and paired with his ability, whereas with Thielen, it was like obviously he knew how to do everything and he could catch anything thrown his way, but like had become sort of limited in terms of his mobility, not mobility, but his speed. So that's not going to be a concern.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that if you get some version of what Thielen does with fresh legs, it could be
Exactly.
a big benefit. And I mean, also, I like just pairing him with KJ Osborne in general because I think you can look at Osborne and say, oh, well, he can't be wide receiver two. And my thought is always, but why not three? And I mean, why not three wide receivers who can do the job? You don't have to, dismiss where he fit in. I thought that especially when Thielen was a little better 2 years ago, early in the season, you saw KJ Osborne where teams could just not keep track of all three wide receivers, Jefferson, Thielen, and Osborne. I think last year, teams were able to slow down Thielen by themselves, and it took a while for Osborne to kind of get it ramped up in a new offense, but I still think he's a very capable wide receiver. So pairing two guys that are kind of wide receiver two-ish together is just what Kevin O'Connell wants. I mean, I never bought into the idea that they signed Josh Oliver so suddenly Kevin O'Connell could turn into Gary Kubiak. I mean, I think that he wants some shades of that, but I don't think that that's what was going on there, that they were just going to run Byron Chamberlain and Shannon Sharp out there all the time. Now, I know that you have questions for me as a Purple Insider subscriber, so I want to let you do that. But I also want to ask you about Chuck Foreman as well, because you and I have gone back and forth about Chuck Foreman, obviously a Vikings legend who is from your area that you've written a lot about.
He's
Not
right
in the
over
Hall
my
of Fame, but yeah, he's
right.
right
He's
behind
like
you. But if
right
you
there.
look at his numbers, his peak, he had one of the great peaks of NFL history. In fact, if you kind of compare his short run to Terrell Davis's short run, if there was a Super Bowl ring there, you'd be like, maybe Chuck Foreman belongs in the Hall of Fame. I want to know your favorite Chuck Foreman story.
Man, I mean, it's got to be. Doesn't it have to be like the snowball story, right? You know that story? I mean,
I
that
don't know
was.
this one. I don't know this one.
Well, come on, this was up in Buffalo. This was in Buffalo, man. Gosh, what year? I get a lot of his prime years. Since I wasn't alive, like they kind of get mixed up for me. His best season, I believe it was 75. There's going to be Vikings fans from that era that are going to get on me if I'm wrong about this. But he was going for the Triple Crown. He was trying to uh, have the most touchdowns scored, the most rushing yardage, and I think the most receptions. Maybe he was trying to do all three of those in one season, and it came down to the final game of the season. They were in Buffalo, and he was against OJ Simpson, of course, and the two of the best running backs or best backs in the game at that point. And he was having a Chuck Foreman game and going off. And of course, it had snowed or it was snowing, and someone they were throwing snowballs at the Vikings on the sideline, and someone threw a snowball that went through his face mask and hit him in the eye, and he had to come out of. He couldn't play after that. So his numbers, he wasn't able to get to where he wanted to. And I mean, that's got to be one of my favorite stories about him. That's probably one of the most famous ones. But here's a guy who, he came out of Frederick High School where I work, and believe it or not, he was a tight end and a defensive tackle at Frederick High School. And he went to the University of Miami. I think initially was considered going to Maryland, and something happened as the coaches switched, and that sort of swung his decision. So he ended up going to the University of Miami, and I'm not even sure what they wanted him as down there. But I think once he got there and worked out, I think he even told me once, like he ran the 40, and they were like, "Oh, I guess we got to get this guy the ball somehow," because he was like the fastest player in their camp. And so eventually, he played numerous positions in college as well. That's another crazy thing about Chuck Foreman and who he became. He wasn't like some bell cow running back at the University of Miami. I think he had like one season. His sophomore year, he broke the Miami record for rushing yardage. It wasn't even 1,000 yards. But you sort of, if you look at that, you're just like, okay, well, the next year you figure they're going to give him the ball, and he's going to become this superstar. But that didn't happen. They moved him to wide receiver based on like matchups because they knew he could catch the ball, and he was like a 6'2" guy. So there were mismatches in there. There were times when like they had injuries on their defensive side of the ball, and the coaches were like, "Hey, man, we need you to go over and play cornerback and shut down this number one wide receiver," and he did it. This guy could literally, and his brother, I interviewed his brother for the story I did last week. His brother said he could have played linebacker if they needed him to. Now, he wasn't like huge in terms of his weight, but he was just like, he could have played anywhere and been really good wherever he played. So it wasn't until the very end of his senior year, after the Miami season was over, he started to go to those bowl games, those senior bowls, and those senior all-star games, and he got on that circuit, and he realized, like, he's better than all these guys. He told me, he's like, I went into this thinking, like, I think I can play with these guys. And then after he was with these dudes at these different events, he was like, these dudes can't play with me. And so, he ended up, I think he told a great story about the Senior Bowl. He went in there, and Weeb Eubank was the head coach of his team at the time, Jets head coach for, Joe Namath, previously the Colts and Johnny Unitas. And he saw Chuck Foreman at practice carrying the ball, maybe fumbling the ball a little bit, and was like, look, come here, I'm going to show you how to hold this ball, and I'm going to showcase you, and you're going to be fine. And that's almost exactly what happened. Like, he got in, it was the Senior Bowl. He rushed for like 160 yards. And that was like in early January, I think, of 1973. And that almost like solidified him as a number one draft pick, as a back. And he'll always tell you, like, I played fullback. I didn't play running back. I was a fullback. And that was just the way, the offenses were built back then. He played really close up behind the quarterback, behind Tarkenton. It wasn't like he was 5 yards behind him. Tarkenton would just snap and turn around and hand it off to him, or he'd throw it to him. I could just go on and on about Chuck. He was like, I've gotten to know him a little bit. I've, of course, researched his background and his playing career. And it's just really sad that here this guy is, he's 73 years old. He can't even get the senior committee to bring his name up for induction. Like, his mother just passed away a few years ago. I remember talking to her and how she was like, I want him to get in before I die. That didn't happen. I even was talking to my buddies at work, and I'm like, at this point, like, I don't think he's getting in. Maybe he's going to be dead by the time they put him in. It's really sad. And you mentioned something, that those Super Bowls. You mentioned Terrell Davis. I was going to say something about that too. I remember writing extensively about Chuck compared to Terrell Davis when Terrell Davis got in, because Terrell had like sort of a short period of time where he was dominant, and then he had an injury that cut short his career. Now, that didn't exactly happen with Chuck. He just sort of he just got worn out over, I think it was an 8-year career. But anyway, the bottom line was, very similar cases and very similar positions. I would have thought that right after Terrell Davis got in, that maybe that senior committee would start to take a little closer look at Chuck's case. But here's what I think is going on with that, and you can tell me what you think about it. Like, that team, the Purple People Eater Vikings, have, I think it's 6, maybe 7 Hall of Famers already. Like, they have defensive linemen, they have Kraus, they have Tarkenton, they have Yari. I think it's like 1970s Vikings fatigue. Like, the senior committee probably sees, okay, they made it to 3 Super Bowls, and lost all 3. How many guys do we have in? Yeah, that's enough. And they're just not willing to reopen the book on that era of Vikings. And I don't know, you could probably draw comparisons with those Bills teams from the 90s and how many guys they have in. But that's sort of what I think about what's going on there. And it's just, it's every time you talk to him, it's almost like he's more and more frustrated about it. You can hear it in his voice,
Yeah, and the NFL has such an unbelievably high standard for the Hall of Fame. There's just so few players who go in, and we talked about this with Harrison Smith. And when I called up the Hall of Fame monitor, which I just pulled up for Chuck Foreman, one of the things that annoyed Vikings fans to bring up was just that, like, the All Pros and a championship, and that shouldn't matter. but it does. And
Yeah,
so if they had won the Super Bowl, maybe there's a little more willingness to put in everybody involved. I also think that fatigue element is exactly right. The Bills had a center named Kent Hall,
can't
who
help.
was one of the
Yeah,
best offensive linemen in the history of the NFL, hands down, would fight anyone to the death on this. He was the centerpiece of their offense and deserved every bit of attention that he could get. But if you didn't make enough Pro Bowls, if you didn't get enough All Pros, which by the way, our ability to, evaluate some of these things has gotten so much better with all the numbers
right.
that we have. So maybe, with Chuck Foreman at a time, we would have looked at the receiving as like, oh, just kind of secondary, but that was a massive part of what made him a unique running back. The Hall of Fame monitor has him as very much a fringe, as he is a fringe Hall of Famer, with guys like Larry Zonka, Corey Dillon, Eddie George, Warwick Dunn, Priest Holmes, Tiki Barber. Like these guys get kind of similar scores. All of them great players, legendary players, but maybe just on the fringe a little bit of the Hall of Fame. And I think that's what happened with Chuck. And the thing is that, longevity, it's like Terrell Davis gets this and no one else when it comes to your peak was just unbelievable. And that goes for all Hall of Fames. Like this is the Dale Murphy thing, right? Like
That's
Dale
right.
Murphy was unbelievable for a short period of time, and then it wasn't enough. But opening a career with 5 straight Pro Bowls for Chuck Foreman is an incredible accomplishment for him. So he probably will have that label of being one of the best players, not in the Hall of Fame, but with football, there's probably 25 guys. Well, who was it? Was it Ron Santo was always the guy? Who was the
Yeah,
guy for the
yeah. I think
Cubs,
that's
right? Who
right.
was always known
Yeah,
as the best player not in the Hall of Fame. There's like 28 players who could make an argument they're the best player not in the Hall of Fame in the
yeah.
NFL, probably 50, right?
Right. But like the thing about Chuck and his game, like translate his game to today. He was 6'2", he weighed 200 and whatever pounds. He could run a 4.5. The dude has more catches than Lynn Swan. Like think about that. I mean, obviously Lynn Swan was a flashy deep threat type guy on Super Bowl champion teams. So yeah, Hall of Famer, no question. But if you're putting him in the Hall of Fame, you got to look at that era and look at the stuff that Chuck was doing, catching the ball that nobody else was doing. And honestly, man, every year another like receiving record is broken by a back and they're like, oh yes, and Chuck Foreman previously owned this record. Like it just happened last year. I just wrote about it. Jerick McKinnon had our old buddy from the Vikings had what was it, 9 receiving touchdowns or something, and he broke a record that was held and shared by Chuck, Marshall Faulk, and believe it or not, Leroy Horde. It was not. Yeah, I think they had 8, and Jerick had 9. But anyway, like those other guys did it in 16 games. Chuck had those numbers in 14 games, and he'll tell you this. Like I think the people that are examining these cases almost just throw out the receiving part of it. They look at his rushing yardage, which really isn't that spectacular, and they look at his yards per carry, which I think is like 3.9 or something, and they just kind of say, that's not enough by comparison for that era. So the whole thing's just it's disappointing from his perspective and from perspective like mine, because it would be a lot of fun to finally write that story and have Chuck get into the Hall of Fame. So
Yeah, it is something that I think probably won't happen, but does
right,
not take away from his Vikings legend at all. So, you, like I said, you're a subscriber, and your support for what I do is greatly appreciated, man. Really, since day one since I moved here, I remember we've just communicated on a regular basis. And you are a great writer, by the way. I read your columns when you put them out there. You also write
thank
some
you.
dad columns and stuff, which I cannot relate to, but I think are really well written. So I read them, and just your kind of personal experience with sports. So people should definitely check out your work as well at Joshua R underscore Smith. Are you serious with the underscore? But that's that's your Twitter. I'm sure there's a lot of
Yeah.
Josh Smiths. So you got to do something there.
There was
But
yeah
I
there
did want to give
there
you
was
opportunities because we
there was a
have.
Joshua. Well, there was a Joshua Smith I think I found on Twitter who's like a writer in England, and he and I followed each other. So there's a lot of us out there for sure. That's the reason for that. It sort of sets me apart a little bit, I guess.
Well, my friend Chris Long here in the media also is friends with Chris Long, the NFL
Oh,
player. So I
right.
guess there is some synergy there. But
I
we
am,
do the
by the
fans
way,
only.
By the way,
Sorry, go ahead.
I am not the Josh Smith that used to be the slam dunk champion of the Atlanta Hawks. That's not me. In case you couldn't tell.
You know what? I did figure that out. Like, I can't
Okay.
tell through the Zoom call how tall you are, but I don't think it's 6'8". So I'm just gonna throw that
No, the
out there.
camera doesn't add 8 inches, unfortunately. So no.
But we do the, we do the
Yes.
fans only podcast. So I feel like I should give you your personal fans only for doing this in exchange for all the great insight on Jordan Addison and Chuck Foreman. So what do you got? What, as a Viking fan, would you like to know from me?
Well, there's a couple of things I was thinking before we got on here, and really, just the first one is like, does Quasi know what he's doing? Like, I mean, he seems like he's super smart. We all know his background. It's just so hard to tell yet if he like actually knows what he's doing. Obviously, this draft class is we have no idea what's going to happen with him. Last year's draft class, we literally like still have no idea. So the quarterback situation for next year, not next year, in 2024 after Kirk's contract is up, is still a complete unknown. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be the BYU kid that they just drafted. Although I did enjoy watching him play the couple times I did. So like, does he know what he's doing?
I'm not sure. I mean, I cannot say definitively yes, but let's think about just like this situation in general this offseason. They did move on from a lot of old pieces, and the expectation is that they will move on from even more with Dalvin Cook. We'll see on za'darius Smith. He's on a short contract anyway, so even if he does come back, that's okay. But Dalvin Cook, not a great idea to have an older veteran expensive running back. They couldn't really favorably move on from him last offseason with the salary cap, so it makes sense to do it now. Not keeping Thielen, not keeping Kendricks. I think those were smart moves. I think restructuring Cousins the way that they didn't love it, but also they didn't have many other options with the salary cap to even get cap compliant. So not locking themselves into a long-term extension with Kirk was a really good idea. I thought he made a mistake in going into too much, maybe just what do they call it, like verbal vomit or something when it
Yeah,
came to answering the question about Kirk's situation and saying like, well, we just put it aside for now. And it's like, wait, is that still a thing? So I think that through his press conferences, there are times where he wants to explain it to you, but he also wants to do the GM dance and he gets caught in the middle sometimes
yeah,
where maybe to that question, and I'll take any answer, but he should just say like, well, I don't really have much more to say about that at the moment and we'll see how it plays out, as opposed to kind of being like, well, we're looking for solutions and maybe we could go back to the table, because then everyone goes, wait, do you guys have no plan?
right,
But it might have just been an attempt at kind of not saying, hey, we're done with Kirk, because if you say that, Kirk's your quarterback this year and he made a mistake publicly, and it's a little I don't know, weird with the whole interview thing that he did
right.
last year. But when he said Kirk was good and it's great quarterbacks who win the Super Bowl, like that made noise right there. So I think that they have gone out of their way to be like, we love Kirk. He's the best. He's so great. To try to make sure there's no manipulation there of him, because he's got to play 17 plus games next season. I think that was a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a mistake. In chess, they would call it an inaccuracy, not a mistake. So I would call it an inaccuracy. But think about this. They draft a receiver, corners, all premium positions. It had a theme to it. It was sort of thematic to giving Brian Flores what he wants. And Kwesi admitted that he was much more comfortable this year than last year. And I think it really showed. So if you're saying like rebuild the defense through versatile pieces that your defensive coordinator wants, draft a wide receiver to set up for the best possible situation for your future quarterback. Don't draft Will Levis if you don't believe in him. And apparently the rest of the league doesn't either. I mean, it's hard for me to say the guy is clueless and that they're screwed. It's just that I think we wanted answer. We wanted more answers than we got. And I actually wrote about that today. We wanted more answers than we got. The one big question is not still answered. And until it is, we can't say, wow, this guy crushed it as GM, or wow, he failed as GM. You know what I mean? I think there's some impatience there, though, from us. But the overall process of a competitive rebuild, it now makes more sense than it did, say, last offseason.
Right. Now that answers my question. And along those lines, like with the quarterback situation, should us as Vikings fans just really root hard for quarterback prospects to just come out of the woodwork this season?
Yes.
Yes, right.
Yes, absolutely. Or, and I don't know who this would be, but like someone great for another team being very mad at their team. I don't know who that
Yeah,
is. Like,
seems to
uh,
happen
I
often
will
though.
say, I mean, think about this though, just for a second. And I don't love Kyler Murray, but Kyler Murray with Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison and say KJ Osborne and TJ Hawkinson and a coach who knows what he's doing. I never believed that Cliff Kingsbury knew what he was doing. So if that ends up happening, that Jonathan Gannon's a mess there and Arizona screws everything up and he demands a trade, like you never know where this is going to go in a year. And I think that think about this, like if we did the old there was the Boy Meets World, if people watched that back in the day, where he was comparing like two choices and he started putting M&Ms on one side or the other. Like how many M&Ms would you put into the side of draft Levis or Hooker, or what's behind door number 2 for next year? And I think that's what it came down to for them is Levis and Hooker have some major issues, not just like, oh, well, every quarterback has problems, major problems that they have that you're taking a huge risk on. This is going to be your one big choice. Did you want to make it on? Do you want to make the bet on those two guys, or what's behind door number 2, which could include Spencer Rattler if he plays great this year? It's not just Caleb Williams and Drake May. Well, how many guys like Anthony Richardson? Nobody even knew going into week 1 the guy was a prospect. And then he demolishes Utah. And it's like, oh my gosh, where did this come from? So that's going to happen this year. I can't guarantee it's going to be an amazing quarterback class, but I think I would take what's behind door number 2 over Hendon Hooker, Will Levis, which were the only actual options.
That was the way I felt about it heading into this. I was glad that they didn't take either one of those guys and use their first round pick on a player that could enhance what they already have, because I just don't feel good about who those two guys are as prospects, and especially with them not having a second round pick. I was completely okay with them not trading like a first next year to get back into the first round or something. I'm ready. I'm waiting. I'm willing to just wait this season out to see what develops with the other quarterbacks in college. And I was quite honestly, I was surprised they took one at all. I didn't think that they would even take a developmental one, but I'm kind of glad they did, because I don't think Mullins is even under contract after this year or something, right? So they need somebody. Excuse me. They need somebody behind, QB1 that can be there and maybe develop into a reliable guy. You mentioned somebody earlier that I wanted to ask you about that I'm just sort of I don't understand it, especially now with them bringing Brian Flores in. Why does za'darius Smith want out? I mean, I think he even announced that he wanted out before Flores was brought in, and that hasn't changed. So, and looking at what Flores does with his players, and looking at za'darius Smith and his skills, should he remain healthy, like I don't know, man, he could be like a player, a big time player in that style or that scheme of defense. So, like, why does he want out?
I'm gonna look this up right now, and I'm gonna see how much cash he's actually scheduled to get, because cap hit doesn't matter to the player; it's only the actual cash, and it might be a
Gotcha.
cash issue for Za'Darius Smith
Gotcha.
more than anything else, because I think that what was reported out there was. And I'm having trouble finding exactly how much cash he's got. Oh, cash paid. Yeah. So he's only scheduled to make $12 million in cash, which is not a lot for a dude who was top 5 in pressures and I know that the second half was not as good, but still, like, his totality of his season was one of the best edge rusher seasons last year, probably in the overall sacks and pressures in the top 10 to 12. And if you're going to make $12 million when the top 10 to 12 guys are going to make $20 million, then you're going to say, find someone who will give me that money, which is why I have sort of left the door open to maybe they just work something out to put a little more cash in his pocket, right? I mean, that could be a possibility, but they don't have much flexibility here to rework his contract or anything else like that, because for all other purposes, it does make sense. I mean, he's been here. It's a similar type of pass rush scheme, and he's the perfect guy for Brian Flores. He wants to move players around. Totally agree with all that. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think Za'Darius Smith is looking at Za'Darius Smith Inc. here and saying, or LLC, and saying, look, and the same goes for Danielle Hunter as well. It's like, yeah, this is a great place for him. Of course it is. And I thought his adjustment to the scheme last year, in maybe after like week 4 or 5, was really tremendous. But if you're only going to pay in cash, Za'Darius Smith and Danielle Hunter combined, what one great pass rusher gets in the league, they're not going to be very happy, and they're going to try to work around that. So I don't know how this gets resolved. That one is less confident than Dalvin Cook, but I think that's what it ultimately comes down to. Is I didn't know that number before, but had a feeling that cash paid was going to be
Okay.
kind of the issue there. So I think what he's looking for is to go to another team that will rework his contract and that will put more cash in his pocket, or just to be released so someone else has to sign him. And then if you think about it, he's really on a 1-year contract. So if someone else signed him to even like 15 million guaranteed, to you and I, we might say those numbers and be like, well, what's the difference between 12 and 15 or whatever? That's $3 million, right? Or 7, whatever. I don't know what he thinks he's worth. I think the league probably has concerns about his knee and his back and wouldn't be willing to do that. But Von Miller, I mean, look what Von Miller got when Buffalo signed him. A desperate team went absolutely nuts for Von Miller and put so much cash in his pocket that it was insane. If you're Za'Darius, you're like, I'll wait and see if we can work this out. But I don't know how that one's going to go. But I think that kind of is the reason, if I had to guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's an expiration date for all of these guys because of this violent nature of the game. So like, it's not hard to understand why even if it's just $3 million, if he's just trying to get as much as he can, because maybe, like you said, maybe he knows something about his knee. Maybe he knows like, hey, I'm not going to be able to play this game for 5 more years, even though some pass rushers can last a long time. He's just trying to get his. Sort of like what I said about Jordan Addison. He's got to look out for number one. How about the draft is over. Probably not too many more guys that are going to be added to this team before, say, training camp. Most intriguing position group for you to watch heading into training camp?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's corner. Running back becomes that a little bit because I think. Have you watched Dwayne McBride highlights?
Yeah, I
Because
did.
I
I did watch
mean,
a little bit of him. I couldn't quite tell how fast he is, and I couldn't even find. I haven't spent a lot of time investigating it, but like, what's his 40 time?
I didn't find that. I
Yeah.
don't. He wasn't at the combine, so I'm not sure like if he had a pro day or what his 40 is. But his highlights are super fun. I mean, this guy like cannot be knocked down. He's like Rocky or something. It's amazing. Like you see like 4 or 5 guys hit him and they just bounce off and everything, which sounds like, oh well, the NFL guys will knock him down. But if there's one stat that actually carries over from college to the NFL, it's yards after contact. And PFF has this thing called elusive rating, which kind of combines broken tackles, yards after contact, and his was through the roof. And so there's a lot of fun runs where your eye thinks, oh, he's just going to fall down, and he doesn't. He's like a weeble. So I think that would be kind of interesting. But all these like quote versatile pieces, these guys who are going to mix into the slot and things like that. Jay Ward. I know that Mekhi Blackman, because some draft analysts didn't like the pick, then people are concerned about it. But I can tell you that does not matter when it's a 3rd round pick. I'm interested in how all these guys play out with the corners, because Caleb Evans, I mean, he tweeted about being in a better mental space this year. I mean, it must have been so hard for him last year with the concussions. Andrew Booth Jr., like, let us not forget that his first impression in camp was really, really good. And then the injuries kind of came there. So how that all plays out, I think, is probably, and I don't really know a lot about Byron Murphy aside from seeing him play a few times against the Vikings. So that whole thing, where he plays, how Brian Flores uses these pieces, and I guess I could say the whole defensive backfield, because Lewis seen, and does he practice to start training camp? Could he be ready for week 1 after his injury? Is he actually going to win that job, or is it going to be Josh Metellus, or is it going to be Cam Bynum? So there is on that defense. I mean, there's so many open things. I don't know what Marcus Davenport's going to look like. So there's a lot there for training camp. I'm excited. It's only 2.5 months away.
I know, right? Be here before you know it. the defensive backfield is what sort of, as a fan, worries me the most because you mentioned those injuries. Booth has a history of it. Couldn't stay on the field. Evans, multiple. We're talking about multiple concussions. Don't know what you're going to get out of him if it's going to happen again. And if it does, he's probably got to take some real time to examine, his future in the game. So I'm with you. That's the position I would be looking at the most, especially because I don't know a whole lot about these kids that they just drafted or Murphy. So I wonder if it's like, at some point in the season where we're going to have Murphy starting aside, one of these later round draft picks on the other end of the field. So that's kind of concerning to me. The running back, what you mentioned was kind of interesting because he breaks tackles and he doesn't go down at first contact, and that's what Dalvin's problem was last year. Like I think age came to get him last year a little bit, and that's why I think most of us are kind of like ready for him to move on. And this kid, I don't know if it signals that's 100% going to happen, but it's time. It's probably time to move on from Dalvin.
Yeah, and it sounds like a lot of the people in the Vikings room liked him as a higher pick potentially, but he kept falling and they decided to take him. But he was evaluated pretty highly by some people, at least the way
Right.
that Kwesi Adofo-Mensah talked about him. But that was the right spot. And this is like, does Kwesi know what he's doing? Let's pull back and look at the positions. I mean, wide receiver, corner, defensive tackle, which is important, and they need defensive tackle depth. And then they wait till the 7th round to get a running back who slips through the cracks, who probably has equal chances to any other running back in this draft of being good if we're looking at it historically. So I think this was a really well-handled draft by Kwesi. The only thing you could draw back is, well, for 1 or 2 picks, they went against the consensus board. But if you're telling me that the consensus is good at the 4th round or 5th round,
Yeah.
I just don't buy that. I think it's really good for the 1st and 2nd. I do not think it's really good past that. How many of those draft analysts were actually watching? But I can tell you how many scouts were. All of them. The scouts were they were bringing these guys in. Anyway, I won't rant about that again. You've heard that. But
Right.
I just think, like, let's not overdo it when it comes to 3rd and 4th rounders. So last thing then, how do you think next season plays out then? Thinking good, thinking
I,
bad? You're not a like roses and flowers guy when it comes to this team.
no, no, I'm a very pessimistic person by nature, and I'm serious when I say this. I think a lot of that part of my personality came from being a Vikings fan because I became one really young. Even in Maryland, I became one really young, and like the heart punches just like began one after another, and I really think that formed some of my personality. I lost my train of thought as to what I was gonna. What was the question? How do I think it's gonna go this year?
Next year.
Man, I think I even mentioned this to you in like a fan's question or a podcast, and it was really right after the season ended or something. I as much talent as that offense has, and still maybe some development to go with the new guard Ingram from last year. Maybe the line solidifies a little bit. Their offense is going to be really fun to watch. But I sort of feel like this is like they're gonna take a step down, like way down, not to 9-8 or 8-9. Like I can see them with that schedule and with having no clue about what some of these pieces are on defense. I can see them losing a bunch of games to really good offenses that they just can't outscore, and them winning 5 or 6 games. I don't want to see that happen. Maybe part of me does. I mean, it's sad and sick that I would say that, but like I'm ready for like a rookie franchise quarterback to come into this organization. Thank you, Kirk, for everything you've done and all of your accurate passes and last year's come from behinds and everything. That was a lot of fun, but very few of us actually believed in that team. It was kind of sad. But I sort of just see like a natural tank coming and them getting a higher draft pick and then maybe even being able to parlay that into a higher one. So that's sort of the way I feel about it. Like who knows how anything's going to play out, but that's the way I felt since the season ended, and this draft really hasn't changed much for me. But last question for you: what's your prediction for Addison's statistics at the end of his rookie year?
I will go with 67 catches for 864 yards and 4 touchdowns. I think
Yeah. Okay.
that's shooting somewhere in the middle, somewhere around where Adam Thielen was last year. And I think that I didn't do the yards per catch, but I'm trying to project a little more in terms of yards per catch than they got from Adam Thielen. But I do think it's going to be a lot of intermediate stuff from Jordan Addison because he's not just going to be a blazing burner. But there is an adjustment curve for wide receivers, but it's not as huge as others. I think he'll have to learn to get off the line of scrimmage. I think he'll have to learn an NFL offense, all those things, but he's going to be open and he's going to make some plays. And I could see it going something like Justin Jefferson, 110 catches, and then Addison and KJ Osborne and TJ Hawkinson all being in that same ballpark as we saw them last year, where it's like, maybe 50 something for KJ and 70 for Hawkinson and 70 or 65. But they're going to throw the ball a ton, I think. I mean, this is one of the reasons also to kind of not, keep Dalvin Cook is that Alexander Mattison to me is better at catching actual passes, where Dalvin Cook was good with screens when he was really explosive, but that didn't really play out. So, I guess I think that they're going to spread the ball around a lot and throw it a ton. So I wouldn't expect this is Jake Reed and Chris Carter from 1994, but I do think that he's going to be a good contributor right away. It's harder to fail here than it would be if you
Right.
were playing somewhere else where they were trying to draft wide receiver one. Like Zay Flowers, I think, has an uphill battle with the Giants. They just don't have anybody else except for Darren Waller because the coach insulted him by breaking news he was getting married or something,
I
which
thought. Wait.
caused the trade. But that's
I thought Flowers went to the Ravens right ahead of the Vikings. I could be
oh, I'm
wrong on
sorry,
that.
the Ravens. Yeah, I meant the
Yeah.
Ravens. I meant the
But
Ravens.
like, what? Yeah, he's not. Zay Flowers is not catching 80 balls or even 60 balls next year, probably with the Ravens. But I think Addison and what you mentioned about KJ and him, like, KJ may not be a great number two option, but the fact that they have him is a luxury, I think, for Jordan because he's not going to have to come in right away and be that number two guy week one. KJ can sort of carry that a little bit if he needs to. They can work Jordan Addison in here and there until he like firmly grasps everything. And I can see exactly what you're saying, like both of them getting 50, 60 catches. And then eventually, like you said before, KJ could leave after this year. And then, Addison will be ready to take that next step maybe. So I think man, you were beating the drum for a long time about them taking a wide receiver round one. I was always right there with you on that and was thrilled and even more thrilled that it was the one that they took because that was really cool for me and my job. And, I can't wait to see what he does.
Yeah, and very cool to be able to get you on, man. We've talked so many times just through messages one way or the other, and can't say enough how much I appreciate all the support you have for me. And like I said, people should go follow you on Twitter because you are a great writer, and I hope to get at some point. Maybe you're going to have to write the Chuck Foreman Hall of Fame argument for Purple Insider. I hope to get a contribution out of you at some
I,
point.
Dude, we'll talk about that. I would love to do that. And dude, seriously, thank you so much for having me on. Like, I listen to it all the time. Like, I'm not at the level of like an Eager or a Trapasso or a Cronin. Like, but hey, this is awesome that I'm like on this show and I can like feel really good about myself for a day because I've shared a screen with those sorts of media personalities and luminaries. So I'm so happy this like finally worked out and we were able to get together like this. So thanks so much.
Yeah, me too. Really appreciate the time. Again, at Joshua R_Smith on Twitter, the Frederick News Post. Really appreciate it, man. And sometime again, the next Vikings draft pick from Frederick, Maryland. We'll be
50
back. We'll
years
do it
from now.
again.
Yeah, 50
Whatever
years.
that may be. All right. Thanks again, Josh.
All right, thanks, man.